Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our fifth in a series of lunchtime webinars with Emily Giske and friends. Hi, Emily. But
Hi.
before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes for those who are joining us for the first time this week. First, please note that at the end of the webinar, we will be holding a brief Q&A session, and this Q&A session is live. Are you able to ask questions at any point during the webinar? So there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If at any point during the presentation a question occurs to you, you can click the Q&A icon there and ask your question, and we will do our best to get to all the questions at the end of the presentation. Second, during today's webinar, we will be showing a PowerPoint presentation, as you can see on your screens. During that time, you might notice that our faces could be obstructing any parts of the presentation. So if that happens for you, please know that you are able to click and drag us to any part of your screen to best see the information in the PowerPoint. So with that, I will hand it over to Emily. Take it away, Emily.
Hi, everyone. This is the time of year that we normally would be on the steps of City Hall and on the couches in Albany, all together and going to Prime and having a great time talking about the public policy issues of the day. But today, instead, we're at our fifth webinar. We miss you all, and we're so glad that you join us every week. Today, we will be talking about crisis communication. We once again look forward to spending the next half an hour with you. I'll give a brief political update and then that has occurred in the past week. And then Anthony Hayes from the Hayes Initiative, a good friend of Bolton-St. John's and a highly sought after communication expert, will walk us through crisis communications. So it's a very great that we have him here with us today. Political overview. So this week, we are continuing to see COVID cases decline across the state. And this week, five regions have been cleared to begin reopening in New York. Central New York, the Finger Lakes, the Mohawk Valley, the North Country, and the Southern Tier. On the legislative front, the Senate and the Assembly held their first remote hearing to discuss the economic impact of the pandemic on small businesses. A lot of the discussions centered around the difficulty businesses have in obtaining the Paycheck Protection loans. We expect the legislature to continue holding remote hearings, and the next one will likely focus on the disproportionate impact the virus has had on low-income communities and communities of color. In New York City, the City Council had passed a number of COVID-related bills this week, including a waiver of sidewalk cafe fees, capping of food delivery and app service charges, and protections for commercial tenants. The more controversial bills, including premiums and employment protections for essential workers, have been laid aside and are unlikely to pass without amendments and aid from the federal government. On the national front, the Vice President and Senator Sanders have announced the names of their joint task force. The group will consist of 48 lawmakers, labor leaders, economists, academics, and activists to advise on the Democratic Party platform, and will include one of New York's congressional members, AOC from Queens. The DNC is preparing for the possibility of holding a virtual convention with a vote to give the party convention committee the authority to change the way delegates vote, in addition to the size and the date of the convention if necessary. And you know, I was born to convene, so I'm very much interested in what happens. The RNC remains committed to holding an in-person convention. However, Trump today was wavering on the location, which currently is set for North Carolina. And now I get to introduce my very dear friend, Anthony Hayes. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Emily. It's great to be here with you and everybody from BSJ, and I want to thank everybody for joining. For those of you that I haven't worked with, I'll give you sort of just a quick overview of my background. I've been in the communication space for about 15 years, ranging from electoral and legislative battles with Emily Giske, as a matter of fact, on marriage equality, who she was a major player in that happening in the state of New York, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, hate crimes legislation. I also manage media and communications for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey during Superstorm Sandy, Bridgegate, which obviously this last week had a Supreme Court moment, and the opening of the World Trade Center site. And then after working on Secretary Clinton's campaign for 2015 and 2016, I started my firm, and that's where Emily and I have sort of partnered back up on a lot of things, and it's great working with the BSJ team again. So just to sort of level set with everybody sort of about what I'm going to walk through, everything is about at a 50,000 foot view. I know we have a short amount of time, so I am going to make sure that, I keep us moving because I want to respect everybody's time. But given that we are in this moment, and I can say as a crisis expert and who's been doing this for a long time, the thing that we're always telling our clients is to make sure they understand that media is a business. And so it's very important to make sure that you approach this when you think about your communication plans as a business, even in a crisis, just because I think it's important to know that. So to level set, what we're going to do is, and if we can go to the next slide, we're going to start by sort of showing you guys some questions that we ask our clients all the time, because it's very important that you make sure when you're thinking about communications broadly outside of COVID, it's that you're being very focused and that you are tailoring your pitches and you actually know who your audience is. And really more importantly, that you actually understand the audience members of the press that you want to be working with you. So as you can sort of see below, there's some statistics from 3,200 journalists that were surveyed pre-COVID. So remember, everything we're talking about right now is sort of the landscape that we thought we'd be living in for 2020. So there's obviously challenges that you can sort of see what journalists are facing, whether that is staffing and resources, et cetera. But the one I want you to focus on the most is 41% of journalists agreed that social media algorithms will change the way they work the most. So this really does sort of get back to the business point of it. And if we can go to the next slide, I think that will also highlight even more sort of how you have to get tailored very quickly. You have to be very targeted and know who you're going for. 1% of the people surveyed said they were getting relevant pitches. Clearly, as you can see from the quote on the right, they really do want you to keep it tight when you reach out and pitch them. So you want to be concise. If we can go to the next slide, this really will give you sort of the idea of how the business works, right? So when you're thinking about pitching a journalist, you do need to understand sort of how they plan their day. Just like you, they go to work and they want to get as much done as possible. But as you can see there, 22.7%, 19%, 9.4%, all of those people plan essentially the day that they show up to work or within that. There's a few people that plan a little bit longer. About 15.5% of the 3,200 journalists that were surveyed plan 1 week ahead. So you really do have to think about that when you're thinking about pitching just broadly. On the next slide, you'll see that journalists considered press releases the most useful brand resource, more than twice as useful as email pitches. So thinking through how you put together your press releases, making sure that they're incredibly targeted and specific is really key. And I think the biggest thing to take away from this is to get to the point. We worked with a producer at the Today Show who once emailed me back and said, put this in 2 sentences or no one is going to read it. So I think there are tons of analogies of people who have summed up why what they're asking you to do is really important or why you should care about it. But my favorite is nearly 20 years ago when Steve Jobs introduced the iPod. It's hard to remember those at this point, but he summed up why everyone should care in just 5 words. And it was 1,000 songs in your pocket. So I think it's important as you sort of look through the next year that you really think broadly about how you're getting very succinct about your message. On the next slide, they talk about how journalists consider the face-to-face or telephone interview the most trustworthy non-brand source. So that really means your third-party validators, not your CEOs, not your comms people, but the external people who will sing your praises and talk about why what you're trying to get them to do is critical. And then if we move to the next slide, you can sort of get the concept of what's the most popular day to pitch news stories, and also what's the day preferred by journalists. 31% of journalists surveyed prefer to receive pitches on a Monday. That's more than any other day. So just keep that in mind, number one, when you're pitching, and then obviously think through when you want to move forward later in the week. It doesn't preclude later in the week, but just their preference is on Monday. So before we move forward, I am going to shift us now into specifically talking about COVID. And as the COVID-19 coverage starts to shift a little bit and subside, hopefully in the coming months, I think it's important for all leaders to think through sort of what it is that they want to try to put out there. I can tell you that a lot of the reporters we talk to are definitely desperate for more human interest stories, those feel-good moments, for instance, when everybody claps in New York at 7 p.m., or the community member who put together a food drive and did certain things. But what we do each week is we work with Cision Insights, and they review over 50,000 plus traditional print, online, TV, radio, and podcast media, as well as all the social channels, WeChat, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, to really sort of get a concise idea of what is actually breaking through in COVID. And last week in the United States, shockingly, COVID news and President Trump sucked up 92% of the media coverage around in the media cycles. So what does that mean for you and your communicators? It means that there is very little room to break through. If we can go to the next slide, we'll get more into the numbers. So again, everything we're looking at now is a review of what broke through last week. And that's an analysis of 24.8 million articles and 357 million social shares. So while there's a lot on here, and I think Ben told everybody that we're going to share this with everybody at the end, so I'm not going to go through everything. But I think the thing I want everybody to look at is the 421,000 shares, and the headline is OC District Attorney warns residents after release of 7, quote, high-risk sex offenders during coronavirus. That's a local news station. Obviously, that's a sexy headline, and I think that would get a lot of play anytime. But the reason I wanted to flag it for everybody is I think a lot of times people do want the big GMAs, New York Times, Time Magazine, but don't discount sort of your local media market for getting some good traction on the message that you really want to get out there. If we go to the next slide, you will see sort of a bit more breakdown of the numbers. Again, COVID took up 72% of the media coverage. President Trump took up 20%. Other things that broke through last week, the stock market performance, the Democratic candidate coverage, the NFL draft, all those got 2%. Sustainability and climate and Syrian conflict got 1%. And I think it's interesting to keep in mind that this is the same week where North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who usually makes a huge splash in media, really only commanded 1% of the global news coverage when everyone thought he was dead. So those are obviously sobering numbers. And I think what we're going to jump into now are some guidance recommendations around COVID and sort of how we're going to move forward. So if we can go to the next slide. Communication professionals have identified 4 phases of communication around COVID-19. To be perfectly frank with all of you, a lot of these phases may sound familiar if you've ever sort of worked through or in a communication shop around a crisis, because there's a lot of things that translate. I'm going to spend the bulk of my time that I have left on phases 3 and 4, just because I believe that we're going to stay in phases 3 and 4 likely for the rest of 2020 and a good part of 2021. But I'll briefly go over phase 1 is really detection. That's when you know that there is something coming, whether that's a storm or in this case, it was obviously the virus. At this point, not much changes internally about your messaging, but your comms team and obviously the folks at Bolton-St who are helping you guys out would monitor government work and also the news part. Really, folks like us typically work with leaders at this point to dig out their crisis communication plan. Hopefully they've got one. If they don't, then we need to quickly put one together for them. But the main thing that you want to be looking at in the detection phase is who's your audience that you're going to have to communicate with. And just briefly on that, organizations and businesses typically have Similar buckets that I'm going to describe here. I'm keeping it fairly general just for this very quick call with you guys. But, there's 3 buckets: corporate communication, management communication, and product communication. Your corporate communication is fairly broad, and it's going to include your employees, customers, investors, regulators, legislators. That's a combination of internal and external communication that you're going to have to make as an organization or a business. Management comms is really solely about your employees. What do they need to know about the crisis? How are they going to work? Where are they going to go? You may have a few external vendors who help run your day-to-day, but largely this is going to be your employees. And the last bucket of audiences that everyone's going to want to communicate is if you have a product. So do you have a product that is actually on the market? So this could be services that you provide regularly that may not be able to be provided, phones, cars, product launches. One brand that obviously has done incredible during this and is really delivering is Peloton. So how do you communicate about your product is what you're going to want to figure out. Is it going to be affected or is it not going to be affected during the crisis? Phase 2, which we are past in COVID, is where you know what it is and you're really starting to shift your communication. So your communication teams are really pivoting into prepping messages that are about the crisis. It is limiting the standard business communication, and that's across everything: TV, print, social media, internal messages. And from phase 2 moving into phase 3 is where you really want to become very clear, succinct, and demonstrate you have a plan and you know how you're going to execute that plan. So now we are largely in phase 3, which is containment, mitigation, and damage control. We've been here basically since March 17th, and I think in New York City in particular, we're going to be here for a little while. Your message at this point typically focuses on supporting your organizational assets. That's both physical and human. But you're also going to, many people begin to look at how they can broadly help as an organization in the community. So gratefully, we've seen a lot of corporate citizenship work where people are donating food or money, PPP, et cetera. Social media is largely about supporting the spread of helpful information. And if you have a product that is disrupted during the crisis, at this point, what you would want to be doing is pointing your customers toward where they can get what they need as it relates to your product so that you remain sort of the information source. On the next slide are going to be some more where we really sort of talk through. Typically, with a crisis, you would move into phase 4, which is repair and recovery. This is a health crisis, and until the health crisis is dealt with, we're going to be in crisis. So it's going to be sustained for most of 2020, just as we sort of figure this out. I would love to be wrong about that. I hope that these words don't age well and that, by August, everything's great, but I just don't believe that that's probably going to be true. Typically, when to move into phase 4, but I believe that we're going to be toggling back and forth between phase 3 and phase 4 for most of 2020. But just to give you a sense of what you might start seeing across the country as people start opening up is in phase 4, you restart production of whatever you were working on before. Sales of products begins if any of that stuff was on hold. You highlight if appropriate, and it's important to really underline appropriate, the outcomes, positive outcomes of the crisis. For employee messaging, you really want to thank them for being flexible. You want to move into optimism and strength. And then as it relates to product launches and events, I think we all are fairly sober to the fact that there's not going to be a back to normal for 2020 and most likely part of 2021. So this is going to require some real outside the box thinking, which I think obviously Bolton-St. John is responding to it in this way where we're able to sort of connect with everybody and talk. And I think the other thing I want to highlight is Cision Insights interviewed 114 journalists between March 25th and March 30th. And again, this is right as we had all sort of shut down. And I think the key takeaway I want you to hear is that, the big word of advice was don't try to capitalize on the crisis. So on the next slide, this is a slide where this is just beyond COVID recommendations. Take time to build relationships with journalists when you don't need something. 37% really do want everybody to focus on what their actual audience is and to understand it. And I think the last thing I'll end with is, from one journalist, that quote is, PR outreach needs to be more targeted and relevant than ever before to stand out. So as leaders, as communication people, it's going to be important that you really sort of get very targeted, understand where you want to go, and really think through what you're going to be doing between phase 3 and phase 4 for the rest of 2020. It was a real honor to be here with everybody. Obviously, I love Emily Giske and the folks at Bolton-St. John, and I will toss it back over to Julie. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony and Emily. So right now we're in the Q&A, and it looks like we don't have any questions, but we'll give people a minute if you think of anything and you want to use the Q&A function on Zoom.
Okay, we have one.
We do. So the first question, do you have an opinion on absentee voting this primary? And that one is for Emily.
I think it's a good thing that everyone should do it with the pandemic still going on. I advise everyone to get their absentee ballot and vote that way as quickly as possible. There's a lot of primaries still on June 23rd besides the presidential, and every vote should be counted.
Thanks, Emily. And the next question we have is for Anthony. How can we engage a journalist when we don't need anything?
That's a great question. And to be honest, a lot of times it's very hard to sort of like do that in your basic day because, the urgent always rushes out the important. And so you end up, having a list of reporters that you want to reach out to, or maybe you don't have a relationship with a set of reporters that you want a relationship with. I think it's important to sort of look at the list that you already have a relationship with, and I would make sure that you're sort of hitting that list regularly, meaning, text them and see how they're doing. If you know it's their birthday, those kinds of things where you don't really need anything, or saw your piece, looked great. And if it's people that you don't know, I think reporters really like the idea that it doesn't mean they're going to respond right away, because as you sort of saw, they're drowning in how to manage their workload. But reporters are very open to reaching out and saying, listen, I sort of saw some of your pieces. This looks incredible. I'd really like to get to know you more and understand more about your audience. I'm working in this, and it may be a good fit, but I don't really have a pitch to pitch you, but I just want to get to know you. And I think sort of they're very open to the networking kind of idea. So I would highly encourage doing that.
Thanks, Anthony. It looks like we have 2 more questions for you. So the next one, are there specific ways we can use social media or Twitter to catch the attention of journalists?
Yeah, so I would say, we joke sometimes of if you need to light yourself on fire, do it. I'm just kidding. Obviously, no one do that. But it's the idea of there's no stone unturned when it goes to outreach. So if you want to direct message somebody on Twitter or Instagram, or you saw a post, or I would definitely say use those. I would find it hard. I probably would focus on, contacting and engaging with their feed more than I would. I wouldn't rely on that if you're really desperate to get a pitch done and seen. I think what I would do is again, going back to how you can sort of utilize this time to make relationships. That's how you do it. You go on, you follow them, you like them, you retweet them. Reporters notice that, they see your engagement, but I would use it as a tool to hit them in terms of, hey, just sent you a pitch, wanted to make sure you saw it, or those kinds of things.
Great, thanks. And we have one last question for Anthony. How do you think about messaging around non-COVID related issues so you don't appear to be tone deaf during the crisis?
It's a great question, and I think it's certainly the $1 million question right now, and I think it's going to be a lot of struggles. In my honest opinion, I think that there's going to be some people, and hopefully people will be generous because I think that as you sort of go back and forth between phase 3 and phase 4, I think you're going to see some people who are like, oh, we can put out this message, and just your sort of region or your state may not be in a space to hear that kind of news, or they may feel like it just may hit people differently. I think, and I think what leaders and organizations are going to have to do is make sure that it is highlighting things like, while this is a great moment, in this time, there's no better time than now to sort of like celebrate successes. And today we had a success. So like acknowledging sort of what we're in, but also sort of like lifting up successes. But I do think if there is a misstep, my strong recommendation immediately would just be to, mea culpa. And if it's a big push, just sort of say, obviously, we're excited to get back to it. We may have been premature. And obviously we respect all of the feedback that we've gotten. Just be very open and not critical, or because it's going to be a complicated year for everybody.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. And I'll hand it back over to Emily to close it out.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. We'll see you next week, and summer will be officially here. So we are excited to see you all, and we hope the state continues to reopen and stay safe.